Hi everyone, it's Ileana and I have another Christmas card to share with you today. I hope you're busy getting all your cards done. I, on the other hand, am still behind, so I'm going to make a few cards out of the same one. I'm going to start with a side folding card, and the reason why I'm doing a side folding card is because this diagonal stripe from Clearly Besotted is just a little bit shorter than 5.5, just by a tiny bit. And by doing a side fold card, I'm able to trim the top and the bottom. I put the stamp in the middle of the MISTI so that the pattern hangs off the edge of the card. If I put it closer to the corner, it would have a little bit of a white border. I'm double stamping this with Alta New Red Cosmos. And then because the card is the same on both sides, I'm just going to flip it around and it will be in the perfect spot. I've already pre-cut my panel and I am just going to use my transparency to try to center the snowman and the reindeer onto the panel. So I've counted the number of grid squares on each side so that it's even. And then I'm just going to use the lines to put my sentiment on. Sorry, my head's in the way. And once I get everything positioned, I'm going to carefully slide the cardstock panel and the transparency at the same time. That way I don't have to worry about placement of my cardstock. I'm going to use my magnets to hold everything in place, and I'm going to double check it one more time and then pick up my stamps. I want to check the sentiment that I've stamped, that I'm going to stamp, so I'm just going to use my grid paper. I'm just going to stamp up the images. It does take me a couple of tries to get the sentiment correct because it's just a little bit curved on the end. And it's very hard to tell just because I'm getting to that age where it's hard for me to tell if it's exactly straight or not. So I'm just going to lift up the edge and just adjust it with my finger. I'm going to turn my paper around so that I could use those lines again. And it's still not quite straight, so I'm going to adjust it one more time. I'm going to stamp, and it's fine now. I'm going to add a scrap piece of cardstock up at the top because the Santa is going to be fussy cut and popped up. So I'm just going to use some scrap paper and I'm going to stamp everything at the same time. And I'm going to do multiple of these. This is probably something that you could do, stamp everything ahead of time and then take it with you and color it on the go or watching some TV. I'm just going to quickly color the Santa Claus. I'm not going to worry about staying in the lines. I didn't worry about shading just because it was a small area. And I found that red tends to bleed. So if you put too much Copic marker in a small area, it'll kind of feather into areas you don't want it. So I'm just going to color it. You could just add some shading with the same color after the first coat has dried. That usually works as well, but I wasn't too worried. So I've colored everything that's red on the base panel too, and with this part I have to be careful to not go outside the lines. And then now I'm going to go back and I'm going to do the black, and I'm trying to keep the colors consistent. And for the Santa's hat, I'm going to use the W8 and I'm just going to go around the edges, and then I'll take the W7 and I'll blend it in and it'll look like a highlight. I didn't worry too much about shading on the scarf or the nose or anything like that. I just wanted to get the coloring done. I'm to that stage where I just need to get cards done and not be so meticulous. People still enjoy them anyways. And so these are little balloons. At first I didn't realize they were balloons when I designed this card, and then I realized that the little nubbies at the bottom are the ties to the balloon. And I'm just going to add some E30 to Santa's face. I'm not going to worry about any shading. I didn't want to worry about the skin tone because, you know, Santa is kind of pasty looking anyways. Doesn't see much sun. So I didn't really mind just keeping it simple. Then I'm using a gold Wink of Stella for the belt buckle. And I just did all of these pretty quickly since the tip to the Wink of Stella is pretty thin. Then I'm taking the W00 and just adding a little bit to Santa's beard so it's not so flat. It looks darker when it's wet, but once it lightens up, you can barely see that there's anything there. And now for the antlers on the reindeer. Oh, and I did the same thing on the snowman too with the W00. Then for the antlers and the belly, I'm going to use the same color, the E34. And I realized that I didn't do the paws, so I'm going to go back. I'm going to do the same technique that I did with the hat on the snowman. I'm just going to do the edges and then I'll blend it out with the W7. And it goes pretty quickly. If you do all of the same sections at the same time, you start to get a little bit faster with maneuvering your pen around or your marker around. And so now I'm going to add that E34 to the belly. And for the reindeer, I wanted it to be a little bit darker, and the color that I'm using is, let me look at my notes here, it's the E37. And I'm just adding it to the edges. I did do a little bit of shading on this one just because it was more noticeable on my sample. And so I went with the darker color and then I went back and I colored it in with a lighter one. And there is no in-between shade, so I had to do tip to tip, or I colored it in. I colored it onto an acrylic block and then picked up the color, and so it created an in-between. And so the color that I'm using now is E35 or E34, I can't tell. And so now I'm just coloring it onto this acrylic block, and then I'll just pick it up with the lighter color and then just blending it out. And eventually the darker color comes off the tip of your Copic marker, and so it helps with the blending. I think this is the part that took the longest for me to color, was the reindeer. And then if you go over the eyes by mistake, you can add some white gel pen to the eyes to make them white again. I did speed this up, so I'm actually going 4 times the speed because I am a very slow colorer. Now you guessed it, I'm going to go back and do some overstamping. I'm using my black my Onyx black ink, and it just takes a second to go back and restamp everything. You don't have to do it, but I just like the rich color it provides. And I cut out the part where I fussy cut around the Santa. I did cut off the little pom-pom at the end of his hat. I'm going to add an enamel dot later. I'm just going to take a black marker and I'm going to go around the edges of the Santa. It'll clean up any areas that I may have missed. And it makes it look like a die cut instead of it being fussy cut. And now I'm going to assemble my card real quick. And you can see that there's a little bit of white on the opposite corners of the card base. So I'm just going to grab my trimmer and cut that off. And now I'm going to add my card front onto a small black panel, and it's just a tiny bit bigger than the card, just to add a little bit of a different color. And since my mat is dark, I'm going to use the inside of my card to see how much to put on each side of my card front. And now I'm just going to add some foam to the back of my piece there. And you can just do this flat if you like. I just like to add a little bit of dimension. With this card, it's not going to add any extra postage. It'll still fit into the specifications for mailing. And I'm just going to center it. And because I trimmed off part of the card base, I'm going to need to trim off part of the piece I just added. So I'm just going to use some long scissors and just to trim it straight across. And I did forget to remove the backing to the foam, so I go back and do that later. But I like to do just the middle. That way, if I get it off, then I can adjust it. Now this is the part where I realized that I needed to add the little tails to the balloon, and so I just grab an acrylic block and I'm just going to use some fog ink from Simon Says Stamp. It's super light, so if I don't get a perfect impression, you'll barely be able to see it. And so I'm positioning the Santa about where I want it, and then I'm just going to stamp real quick. For the remainder of the cards, I could go back and add it onto the MISTI, but it was just as fast to use an acrylic block. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of foam to the back of the Santa. And then once everything is assembled, I'm going to go back with a Wink of Stella. I'm going to add a tiny little strip to the little balloon. I don't want it to get caught in the envelope, and so I'm just going to add a tiny little strip to the bottom. And then I can't get my fingernail to get underneath the backing, so I had to use my tweezers to get it up. And now I'm just going to kind of off-center him. And I believe I'm looking for my enamel dots. You could use some of the Crystal Nouveau, the white, but I have enamel dots, and so I just need to use up the supplies. Might as well just use everything that I got, right? Now I'm just going to add a little bit of Wink of Stella to all of the little characters on the front of my card. And I was nervous about going over the white after I had gone over the red, and so I just double checked to make sure that nothing had transferred onto my Wink of Stella before going onto the white. And you don't have to cover the whole thing. You can go over just certain elements to add a little bit of dimension. Like you can just do the red the nose and the Santa and the scarf, and then just leave it at that. And thanks so much for watching and hanging in there with all the coloring and the overstamping as I usually do. Be sure you give this video a thumbs up and also hit the subscribe button. And I hope you're enjoying your card making this holiday season. Bye.